The scream came before the sunrise even touched the training yard. Owen hit the ground hard, his shoulder cracking against packed dirt, and before he could even lift his head, a weight dropped on top of him that felt more like a falling tree than a man. Teeth found his forearm. Not deep, not lethal, but fast and sure, the kind of bite that said stop moving, and meant it. Owen screamed again, this time from pure shock, and the yard around him went still. Nobody moved to help him. That was the strange part. 12 pack members stood scattered across the training field, all frozen mid-motion, weapons half raised, breath caught in their throats, and not one of them stepped forward. They all knew better. When Cale went still like that, crouched low with his lips pulled back and his eyes gone flat and dark, the smartest thing any person could do was wait it out. Getting close only meant becoming the next target. Cale released Owen's arm after 3 long seconds, stood, and backed away in one smooth motion, like a shadow pulling back into a wall. He did not apologize. He never did. He simply turned in a slow circle, scanning the yard, chest rising and falling too fast, shoulders pulled up near his ears, the way they always were when something inside him had snapped loose. Owen scrambled backward, clutching his arm, more furious than hurt. "He's out of control," Owen shouted, not to Cale, but to the yard, to the pack, to anyone who might finally agree with him out loud. Someone needs to do something about him. Nobody answered. Nobody ever did. They all just looked away, the way people look away from something too painful to watch twice. Cale did not seem to hear the accusation, or if he did, it did not register as words he needed to respond to. His attention had already moved somewhere else, somewhere past the training field, toward the tree line, at the edge of the clearing. His head turned, slow and sharp, like an animal catching a scent on the wind. Whatever he saw or smelled there made something in his posture change. The tension along his spine did not disappear, but it softened, just slightly, just enough that a person who had spent enough time watching him might notice. Nobody in the training yard cared to notice, except for one person. She had not made a sound the entire time. Wren stood near the fence at the edge of the yard, half in shadow, a bundle of cut herbs in her arms that she had been carrying toward the healer's cabin when the commotion started. She had not flinched during the attack, had not gasped or stepped back like everyone else. She had simply watched, quiet and still, her pale eyes tracking Cale's movements the way a person studies weather before a storm, trying to read what it wants to do next. The scar that ran from her temple down across her cheek to the edge of her jaw caught the early light in a strange way, silver against her skin, old and healed but never quite forgotten. People rarely looked at her directly. It was easier for them to glance past her, to speak around her, to treat her presence as something slightly uncomfortable, like a door left open in winter. She had grown used to that particular kind of invisibility. It did not sting anymore, not the way it used to, mostly. Cale's head turned again. This time it turned toward her. The training yard seemed to hold its breath collectively, as if every person there understood, without needing to be told, that they were about to witness something they had seen dozens of times before, and would still never fully understand. Cale crossed the distance between them without hurry, without the coiled violence that had just put Owen on the ground. His steps were loose, almost lazy, the kind of walk that belonged to someone with nowhere urgent to be. He stopped an arm's length from Wren, and simply stood there. He did not touch her. He never touched anyone, if he could help it, not gently anyway. But he stood close enough that Wren could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the fine tremor still running through his hands, the leftover charge of whatever had triggered him moments before. His eyes, when they met hers, were not empty the way they looked to everyone else. There was something moving behind them, something searching. "You're shaking," Wren said quietly, the first word spoken since the attack. Cale did not answer. He rarely spoke, not because he could not, but because words seemed to cost him something the rest of the pack could not see. Instead, he lowered himself to the ground beside her, folding down onto the dirt like his legs had simply decided they were done holding him up, and sat with his shoulder nearly brushing her knee, staring out at nothing in particular. The yard slowly came back to life around them. People picked up their dropped weapons. Owen was led away by 2 others, still muttering about how someone needed to do something, how this could not keep happening, how one day it would not just be a bite. Nobody argued with him. Nobody agreed with him either. They simply moved around the scene like water flowing around a rock, careful not to look too closely at the boy sitting in the dirt beside the scarred Omega, or at how his shaking had already begun to slow. Ren did not sit down beside him. She never did. Not in public, not where the whole pack could watch and whisper about what it meant. Instead, she crouched, set her bundle of herbs down carefully, and reached out to touch 2 fingers to the back of his hand, light as a falling leaf, there and then gone. "Breathe," she said. "In through your nose. You know how." His breathing slowed. It always did, eventually, when she was near. Nobody else had ever managed it, not the pack healers with their calming teas, not the trainers with their firm commands, not even his own father, with all the authority a father was supposed to carry. Only Ren. Only ever Ren. From the far side of the yard, half hidden behind the wooden fence that marked the edge of the training grounds, Alpha Gideon watched his son sit quietly in the dirt for the first time in longer than he could remember, and felt something in his chest twist that he did not have a name for. Hope, maybe. Or grief. Sometimes those 2 feelings wore the same face. He had stopped trying to reach his son through the front door years ago. He had tried discipline, tried patience, tried every healer and every trainer the pack could offer, and none of it had worked. Not really. Not in any way that lasted. Kale had come back from the attack that broke him as a child, different in a way that could not be fixed with words, or with time. He flinched from kindness like it was a blade. He answered gentleness with teeth. The only creatures who seemed to understand him anymore were the wolves that lived beneath his human skin. And even they, it seemed, had learned to fear most of the pack. Except her. Gideon had noticed it months ago, the way his son's eyes tracked Ren across a room, the way his shoulders dropped a fraction whenever she walked past, the way he had started finding excuses to be near the healer's cabin at the hours she was most likely to be there. He had said nothing about it at first, worried that drawing attention to it might scare the fragile thing away before it had a chance to grow into something real. But watching him now, sitting calm in the dirt while the rest of the pack still buzzed with fear and anger, only a few feet away, Gideon allowed himself, just for a moment, to hope. He did not approach. Approaching would have ruined it. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the main hall, already turning over a plan in his mind, one he was not yet ready to admit to himself, let alone speak aloud. Ren stayed crouched beside Kale a while longer, long after the yard had emptied, and the sun had climbed fully over the tree line. She did not ask him what had triggered the attack on Owen. She had learned not to ask questions like that, not because she did not care, but because she understood, in a way most of the pack never bothered to, that answers were not always something a person could give, even when they wanted to. Instead, she talked, quiet and steady, about small things. About the herbs she needed to gather before the frost came, about a bird she had seen nesting near the healer's cabin that morning, about nothing important at all, the kind of talk that asked nothing of him, that did not require a response, that simply filled the space between them like warm water filling a cold room. Kale listened. He always listened, even when the rest of the world assumed he understood nothing at all. When she finally stood to leave, gathering her herbs back into her arms, he rose with her, wordless, and fell into step half a pace behind her shoulder, the way he always did. It had started small, this trailing of hers, a habit nobody had planned and nobody could explain. First it had been a few steps here and there, him appearing near the healer's cabin when she worked, lingering at the edge of the training yard when she passed through. Then it had become constant, an unspoken rhythm the whole pack had learned to expect without ever understanding it. Where Ren went, Kale went. Always a step behind, always watching, never far. The pack called him feral behind closed doors, called him broken, called him dangerous, and none of those words were entirely wrong. But none of them were entirely right either, and the only creature who seemed to know that was walking a few feet ahead of him, carrying a bundle of herbs toward a cabin at the edge of the woods, utterly unafraid of the boy who had put 3 grown wolves in the healer's care that very season. They passed Nora and Callum near the well, both of whom stopped their conversation the moment they saw Kale approaching, instinctively stepping back to give him room, the way everyone did. Ren did not step back. She never had, not since the very first day, and it was that single fact, more than anything else, that had first caught his attention months ago, back before the trailing started, back before anyone in the pack understood what was happening between them. She had not been afraid of him then. She was not afraid of him now. And somewhere in the tangled, damaged wiring of a mind that trusted almost nothing, that single fact had become the only steady ground he had. At the healer's cabin, Ren set her herbs down on the wide wooden table and began sorting them by hand, separating the ones that needed drying from the ones that needed to be crushed fresh. Kale settled into the corner near the window, the spot that had unofficially become his over the past several weeks, and watched her work with the same quiet focus he brought to everything, as if memorizing the exact way she moved might somehow keep the ground from shifting beneath him again. Neither of them spoke for a long while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that only existed between two people who had stopped needing to fill every space with noise, who had learned that presence alone could say more than words ever managed to. Outside, the pack continued its day, unaware that the story circling their halls, the one about the Alpha's feral son who bit anyone who came too close, was about to change in ways none of them could yet imagine. Owen would spend the rest of the day telling anyone who would listen about the attack, adding a little more danger to the tale each time he told it, until by evening it would sound like Kale had nearly torn his arm from its socket, rather than delivered a single controlled bite, meant only to make him stop moving. Nobody would mention the part where Kale sat quietly in the dirt afterward, calm as still water, beside the one person in the entire pack who had never once raised her hand against him, never once flinched from him, never once looked at him like he was something to be managed, rather than someone to be understood. That part of the story belonged only to the two of them, for now. But stories like that rarely stay small for long, and somewhere beyond the tree line, in the shadowed hills where a rival pack watched the borders with patient, calculating eyes, someone had already begun asking questions about the Alpha's broken son and the scarred Omega he could not seem to leave alone. Questions that would not stay quiet for much longer. Inside the cabin, Ren finished sorting her herbs and glanced over at Kale, still sitting in his corner, still watching her with that same unreadable focus. She offered him a small piece of dried fruit from a bowl on the table, holding it out without ceremony, the way she always did. He took it from her hand carefully, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and for the first time all morning, something in his face came close to softening into what might have been, on anyone else, the beginning of a smile. Ren smiled back, small and real, and turned back to her work, unaware that this quiet, ordinary moment, herbs on a table and dried fruit shared between two broken people who had somehow found their way to each other, was the exact moment everything in the pack would later point back to and say, that was when it started. That was when the feral boy began to change, and that was when the scarred girl nobody wanted stopped being invisible. Neither of them knew it yet, but the pack would know it soon enough, and not everyone would be glad to see it. Rain had started falling by the time Ren reached the edge of the healer's garden the next morning, and she was so focused on covering the drying racks that she almost did not notice Kale already standing there, soaked through, waiting. "You've been out here all night," she said, more statement than question. He did not answer, which was answer enough. Water ran down his jaw and dripped from his sleeves, and his eyes had that hollowed, sleepless look she had learned to recognize over the past several weeks, the look that meant his mind had spent the dark hours chasing something it could not outrun. Ren set down the tarp she had been carrying and studied him for a moment, unbothered by the rain soaking through her own cloak. "Come inside before you catch a chill," she said, and turned toward the cabin without waiting to see if he would follow. He followed. He always followed. Inside, she built up the small fire in the corner hearth and pulled a worn blanket from the shelf, tossing it toward him without ceremony. He caught it, held it for a moment, like he was not sure what to do with an object offered so freely, then wrapped it around his shoulders and lowered himself into his usual corner near the window. "Owen's arm is healing fine," Ren said, filling the kettle, "in case you were wondering." Something flickered across Kale's face, too fast to name, but Ren had spent enough time watching him to catch even the smallest changes. Guilt, maybe, or something close to it. He rarely showed remorse, the way other people did, in apologies and soft words, but she had begun to notice the quieter signs, the way his jaw would tighten, the way his gaze would drop to the floor. "He provoked you," Ren said simply, setting 2 cups on the table. "I saw the whole thing. He grabbed your arm from behind without warning. Most people in this pack would have done worse than bite." Kale's eyes lifted to hers, surprised, as if it had not occurred to him that anyone might see the situation that way, that anyone might place even a fraction of the blame somewhere other than on him. "You don't have to defend me," he said quietly. His voice, when he used it, always came out rough, like it did not get exercised enough to run smoothly. "I'm not defending you," Ren said, pouring hot water over crushed herb leaves in each cup. "I'm telling you what I saw. There's a difference." He watched her carry the cups to the table and set one in front of him, steam curling up between them. He did not drink it right away. He rarely did anything right away, as if every action needed to be examined first from every possible angle before he could trust it. "Everyone else just sees the bite," he said eventually. "Nobody sees what happens before it." "I do," Ren said. The simplicity of the answer seemed to catch him off guard. He looked at her for a long moment, studying her face the way he studied everything, cataloging details other people rushed past without noticing. The scar along her cheek, the steady patience in her eyes, the complete absence of fear that had confused him from the very first day they met, back when he had assumed, the way he assumed about everyone, that eventually she would flinch too. She never had. "Why do you stay?" he asked, the question coming out low, almost hesitant, like he was not sure he had the right to ask it at all. "Everyone else keeps their distance, you don't." Ren wrapped her hands around her own cup and considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things he asked her, rare as those questions were. "Because you've never once given me a reason to be afraid of you," she said. "You're careful with me. Even when you're not careful with anyone else, you're careful with me. I noticed that a long time ago." Kale's grip on the blanket tightened slightly. It was true, and they both knew it was true, though neither of them had ever said it aloud before. In all the months since she had first stepped between him and a threatened attack, in all the times his temper had snapped and his control had slipped, he had never once turned that violence toward her, not even by accident, not even when his mind was furthest from reach. Something in him, some instinct buried deeper than the fear and the fury, recognized her as safe ground, and it refused to let that ground be disturbed. "I don't understand it either," he admitted. "You don't have to understand it," Ren said. "You just have to trust it." They sat in silence after that, drinking their tea, while the rain drummed steadily against the cabin roof, and for a while, the world outside, with its whispers and its fear, and its rigid pack hierarchy, felt very far away. It did not stay far away for long. The cabin door opened without a knock, and Iris, one of the younger healers who assisted Ren on busy days, stepped inside shaking rain from her cloak. She stopped short at the sight of Kale sitting calmly by the fire, blanket around his shoulders, and her eyes went wide with the particular alarm that most of the pack reserved for him. "I didn't realize you had company," Iris said carefully, addressing Ren but keeping her gaze fixed on Kale. "He's fine," Ren said, not looking up from her tea. "He's resting." Iris did not look convinced. She busied herself at the far end of the cabin, sorting supplies with quick, nervous movements, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting the quiet boy by the fire to suddenly transform into something dangerous. Kale noticed the glances. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. But he said nothing, kept his eyes on the fire, and let the tension in his shoulders build silently instead. Ren noticed it too, the way his stillness had turned brittle, the way his hand had curled tighter around the edge of the blanket. She reached over without a word and set her hand lightly over his, not gripping, just resting there, a small anchor. The tension eased, just slightly. Iris finished her sorting and left as quickly as she had come, murmuring something about needing to check on a patient in the main hall, though Ren suspected the real patient she was avoiding was sitting 3 feet away from her, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, doing nothing more threatening than staring at a fire. "She's afraid of me," Kale said, once the door had closed. "Most of them are," Ren said honestly. She had never been the type to soften truths into something more comfortable. "But that's fear, built on stories, Kale, not on what you actually do." "The stories aren't wrong," he said. "I did put 3 people in the healer's care this season. Because they cornered you, provoked you, or grabbed you without warning," Ren said. "Every single time. I've watched every single time." Nobody in this pack seems to remember the part where they started it. Kale was quiet for a long moment, turning that thought over the way he turned over most things she said to him, slow and careful, testing it for weaknesses before allowing himself to accept it. "My father remembers," he said eventually. "I think that's why he keeps trying to fix me, instead of giving up." "Maybe you don't need fixing," Ren said. "Maybe you need people who know how to be around you, without provoking something that isn't even about them." It was the closest either of them had come to naming what had grown between them over the past months, and the words hung in the warm air of the cabin, like something fragile that neither wanted to disturb by looking at it too directly. Kale's gaze dropped to where her hand still rested over his, and for the first time since she had known him, he turned his hand beneath hers, palm up, fingers curling loosely around her own. It was not much. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing at all. To Ren, who understood exactly how much trust it took for Kale to allow contact he had not initiated and could not fully control, it felt like watching a locked door creak open by a single, careful inch. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and unhurried, and somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen by either of them, a pair of scouts from the rival territory to the east crouched low in the underbrush, watching the healer's cabin, with sharp, patient eyes, taking careful note of exactly who came and went, and how long the Alpha's broken son had been spending inside. Alpha Gideon called his son to the main hall 3 days later, and the summons alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through every corner of the pack grounds by mid-morning. Kale rarely entered the main hall. The high ceilings and gathered council made his skin crawl, made the walls feel like they were pressing in from every side, and everyone who had ever tried to force him into formal settings knew how badly those attempts tended to end. Ren was not summoned. She came anyway, trailing a few steps behind Kale, the way he so often trailed behind her, and nobody stopped her at the door. Nobody dared to, not with the way Kale's shoulders had already begun climbing toward his ears at the mere sight of the hall's tall doors. Inside, the council had gathered along the long table that ran the length of the room, faces set in expressions ranging from concern to open suspicion. Gideon sat at the head of the table, and beside him stood a man Ren did not recognize, broad through the shoulders, with a calculating look in his eyes that made the hair on the back of her neck rise before he had even spoken a single word. "This is Declan," Gideon said, gesturing toward the stranger, "Alpha of the Eastern Territory. He has come with concerns." Declan's gaze slid over Kale with open assessment, the kind of look a person gives livestock at market, and then shifted, curious, toward Ren standing at his side. "So the stories are true," Declan said, a faint smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "The feral son follows the scarred girl everywhere." "How touching." Kale's jaw tightened. Ren felt the shift in him immediately, the way his weight rocked forward onto the balls of his feet, the way his breathing changed, quick and shallow, priming for a fight his body wanted before his mind had fully caught up. "Careful," Ren murmured, low enough for only him to hear. He stilled, though the effort it cost him was visible in the white of his knuckles. "I've heard concerning reports," Declan continued, addressing Gideon now, though his eyes kept flicking back toward Kale, with something that looked less like genuine worry and more like careful calculation. "3 of your own wolves injured this season alone. A pack whose future alpha cannot control his own instincts is a pack vulnerable to challenge. I raise this only out of respect for old alliances, Gideon, nothing more." The threat beneath the polite words was not subtle, and every wolf at the table understood it clearly. A pack, seen as weak, as unstable, invited exactly the kind of scrutiny that could unravel decades of careful boundary agreements. Declan was not here out of concern. He was here to measure weakness, to see with his own eyes whether the rumors of a broken heir were true, and whether that weakness might be worth exploiting. Gideon's expression remained carefully neutral, though Ren could see the tension bunched along his jaw. "My son's instincts protect this pack," Gideon said evenly. "Every incident this season occurred because someone provoked him first. I have reviewed each report personally." "Instincts that cannot distinguish provocation from an innocent hand," Declan said, "are not instincts I would trust guarding a border, let alone leading a pack." "He is not leading anything yet," Gideon said, an edge finally creeping into his voice. "And he will not until he is ready, on his own terms, at his own pace. This pack does not rush its heirs into positions they are not prepared for." Declan's smile did not waver. but something behind his eyes sharpened, filing away information for later use. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I only meant to offer my concern as an ally, nothing more." His gaze drifted once more toward Ren, lingering a beat too long on the scar along her cheek. "Though I confess I am curious what hold this young Omega has over him. The pack whispers she is the only creature alive he does not attempt to harm." "That is none of your concern," Gideon said, his voice dropping into something with real weight behind it, the voice of an alpha rather than a host entertaining a guest. Declan inclined his head, conceding the point with exaggerated grace, though the calculation in his eyes did not fade. "Of course. Forgive my curiosity. I will take my leave then, and let you manage your own affairs." He turned toward the door, then paused, glancing back one final time. "Though I would think carefully, Gideon, about what happens to a pack's stability when its heir's temper is tethered to a single, fragile thread. Threads, after all, can be cut." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed carried a weight none of the council members seemed eager to break. Declan left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the long hall, until the outer doors closed behind him with a heavy, final sound. Gideon exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his face, looking older in that single moment than Ren had ever seen him look before. The council members began murmuring among themselves, low and worried, and Cale stood rigid at Ren's side, his eyes fixed on the door Declan had disappeared through, his whole body coiled tight with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but sat uncomfortably close to both. "He threatened her," Cale said quietly, the words rough and low. "He was testing us," Gideon said, though his own voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Trying to see how we would react, trying to find the cracks." "He found one," Cale said. His eyes moved to Ren, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before he could stop it. "He found me." Ren stepped closer, ignoring the eyes of the entire council still watching them, and set her hand against his arm, grounding him the way she always did. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Whatever he was trying to do, it doesn't change that." Gideon watched the exchange with an expression that mixed relief and worry in equal measure. He had hoped, quietly and without ever saying it aloud, that whatever bond had grown between his son and the scarred Omega might one day become something the pack could rally around, proof that Cale was not the broken thing so many believed him to be. He had not considered, not fully, what it would mean to have that bond identified as a weakness by an outside threat, a thread that clever, patient enemies might try to cut. "I want extra eyes on the eastern border starting tonight," Gideon said to the council, his voice regaining its authority. "And I want to know everything Declan's people have been asking around the outer villages these past weeks. If he came here to gather information, I intend to know exactly what he found." The council dispersed to carry out his orders, murmuring uneasily among themselves, casting glances at Cale and Ren that lingered a moment too long before they filed out of the hall. Gideon remained behind, watching his son and the Omega at his side with a complicated mixture of pride and fear knotting in his chest. "You should both stay close to the main grounds for the next several days," Gideon said, "until we understand what Declan is truly after." Cale nodded once, stiff and reluctant, clearly unused to being given instructions rather than simply enduring correction, and Ren echoed the gesture beside him, though her eyes remained fixed on the tall doors Declan had exited through, an uneasy feeling settling low in her stomach that she could not quite name. Whatever the Eastern Alpha had come looking for, she suspected he had found more than enough to be dangerous with. The border watch lasted a full week before anyone found anything worth reporting, and by the time Finn came sprinting back from the eastern ridge with news of tracks crossing the boundary line, the whole pack had already grown twitchy with waiting. 3 sets, Finn reported, breathless, to the small group gathered near the main hall. Maybe 4, moving parallel to the border, not crossing, just watching. Whoever they are, they know how to stay hidden. I only caught the tracks because it rained last night, and the ground held the print. Gideon's expression darkened. Declan's scouts. "Could be," Finn said. "Could also be nothing. Could be traitors, passing through who got turned around. Traitors don't move in formation, 3 sets wide along a hostile border," Gideon said. "Double the patrols. Nobody goes out alone until we know more." The order rippled through the pack quickly, and with it came a fresh wave of tension that settled over the grounds like a low fog. Cale felt it too, sharper than most, his senses already tuned to threat in ways the rest of the pack could not match. He had spent the past week unusually restless, pacing the edges of the training yard at odd hours, watching the tree line with an intensity that unsettled even the wolves who normally avoided looking at him directly. Ren noticed the change most of all. He had started sleeping less, if he slept at all, and the careful calm she had spent months helping him build seemed to be fraying at the edges under the weight of an unnamed pressure he could not fully explain, even to her. "Tell me what's wrong," she said one evening, finding him crouched near the fence line at the edge of the healer's garden, watching the darkening woods with an unblinking focus. "Something's coming," Cale said, his voice low and certain in a way that made her stomach tighten. "I don't know what yet, but it's close." "Your senses, or just worry?" Ren asked carefully. She had learned, over the months, that Cale's instincts ran sharper than most wolves in the pack, a side effect, perhaps, of the same trauma that had left him so wary of nearly everyone. His nose could catch scents others missed. His ears could pick out footsteps from twice the distance. It made him valuable as a sentinel, even if the pack rarely thought to use him that way, too distracted by the fear his reputation inspired to consider the gift buried beneath it. "Both," he admitted. "I keep catching a scent near the tree line. Faint, not from anyone in the pack." Ren followed his gaze toward the darkening woods, unease prickling along her arms. "Have you told your father?" "He already doubled the patrols," Cale said. "It's not enough. Whoever's out there, they're patient. They're not going to make a mistake the patrols can catch. Then what do we do?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing over something difficult. "I could track it myself," he said finally. "Follow the scent back to its source. See what they're actually planning instead of guessing." "Alone?" Ren's voice sharpened with alarm. "Cale, if it is Declan's people, and they catch you out there alone, that's exactly the kind of opportunity he'd want." "I'm not helpless," Cale said, a flash of old defensiveness creeping into his tone. "I didn't say you were," Ren said evenly, refusing to back down from the sudden edge in his voice, the way she always refused. "I said it's dangerous, and dangerous isn't the same as helpless. There's a difference between being brave and being careless, and right now, what you're describing sounds like the second one." Cale's shoulders dropped slightly, the defensiveness draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. He was not used to being challenged without also being feared, and something about the particular combination of Ren's honesty and her lack of fear always seemed to disarm him faster than anything else could. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, quieter now. "We tell your father everything you've noticed," Ren said. "Together, let him decide how to use it. You don't have to carry this alone, Cale. That's the whole point of a pack, isn't it? Nobody's supposed to face the dangerous things by themselves." He looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he nodded. They found Gideon in his study, going over reports by lamplight, and when Cale described the scent he had been tracking near the tree line, the pattern of when it appeared and disappeared, the careful and deliberate way it seemed to be probing the boundary without ever quite crossing it, Gideon's expression grew sharper and more focused than either of them had seen it in days. "This matches what Finn found," Gideon said, spreading a rough map across his desk. "If they're testing the boundary here and here," he tapped 2 points along the eastern ridge, "they're likely looking for the weakest stretch of the patrol rotation, probing for gaps." "Why probe at all if Declan already came here openly?" Ren asked. "Why not just say what he wants?" "Because coming here openly told him what he wanted to know about our stability," Gideon said grimly. "Now he's gathering information about our defenses, 2 very different kinds of scouting, and both concerning in their own way." Cale leaned over the map, studying the marked points with the same intense focus he brought to everything, and after a moment, tapped a third location, slightly further south than the other 2. "There," he said. "The scent was strongest there. 2 nights ago." Gideon's eyebrows rose. "You're certain?" "I don't forget scents," Cale said simply. Gideon studied his son for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, some old assumption quietly recalibrating itself. He had spent years thinking of Cale's heightened senses as simply another symptom of his instability, another piece of the fractured whole that made him difficult and unpredictable. It had not occurred to him, not until this exact moment, watching his son point with total confidence to a spot on a map that matched exactly what his scouts had already found through hours of careful searching, that those same instincts might be one of the sharpest tools the pack possessed. "I want you both to stay close to the grounds," Gideon said finally, folding the map. "But Kale, I want you working with Finn's patrol from now on. Your senses could make the difference between catching a threat early and catching it too late." Kale blinked, clearly caught off guard by the offer, an offer that sounded less like the careful management he was used to, and more like genuine trust. "You want me on patrol? I want you using what you're good at," Gideon said, "instead of being managed like something broken that needs watching. You've spent your whole life being handled, Kale. Maybe it's time this pack started using your strengths instead of just bracing for your weaknesses." Something passed across Kale's face that Ren had never seen there before. Something raw and hopeful and slightly disbelieving, like a man being handed a door he had assumed was permanently locked. He did not say anything, but the way his shoulders straightened, the way his chin lifted, said enough. Ren watched the exchange with quiet warmth spreading through her chest, and beneath it, a thread of worry she could not quite shake. Whatever Declan was planning, it was clearly bigger than a single visit meant to test boundaries. And now Kale, already a target simply for being the Alpha's heir, was about to place himself directly in the path of it. She only hoped his newfound purpose would not come at a cost. Neither of them was ready to pay. Patrol duty suited Kale in ways nobody, including Kale himself, had expected. He moved through the forest differently than the other wolves, less bound by trained formation, more attuned to the subtle language of broken branches and disturbed leaves that most patrols walked straight past without noticing. Finn, who led the small patrol group, found himself deferring to Kale's instincts more often than not, adjusting the group's path based on a single raised hand, or a slight shift in Kale's posture that meant something ahead was worth investigating. "You've got a nose for this," Finn admitted on their fourth night out, crouched beside Kale at the edge of a ravine, while the rest of the patrol waited a short distance back. "Better than mine, honestly." Kale did not answer right away, still scanning the tree line below them with narrowed eyes. Compliments were foreign territory, words he had not been offered often enough to know quite how to receive them. "It's just scent," he said eventually. "Anyone could learn it." "Nobody else in this pack could learn it the way you do," Finn said. "I've watched you catch a trail. 3 of us walked right past. That's not something you teach. That's something you're built for." Something in Kale's chest loosened at the words, a knot he had not fully realized he was carrying, until it began to ease. He had spent so many years being spoken about in careful, worried tones, treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person with anything worth offering, that Finn's easy, matter-of-fact respect landed strangely, like sunlight through a window that had been shuttered for years. They found nothing that night, nor the night after, but on the 7th night, deep along the southern boundary Kale had marked on his father's map, the wind shifted and carried with it a scent Kale recognized instantly. He froze mid-step, one hand raised, and the rest of the patrol went still behind him, without needing to be told. "There," he whispered, nodding toward a dense cluster of brush a short distance ahead. 2 of them, maybe 3, waiting. Finn signaled the patrol to spread out silently, and they closed in from 3 directions, moving with the careful precision of wolves who had trained for exactly this kind of moment their whole lives. Kale led the approach, his senses sharper than anyone else's in the group, guiding them with small, precise gestures until they had the hidden watches boxed in without a single twig snapping underfoot. The confrontation, when it came, was fast and controlled. 2 scouts from the Eastern Territory, caught crouched at the boundary line with a rough map of the pack's patrol routes already sketched onto a scrap of hide, found themselves surrounded before they had any real chance to flee. One of them bolted anyway, sprinting hard toward the boundary line, and it was Kale who caught him, moving faster than any of the others could track, bringing him down with a controlled tackle that left the scout pinned and unharmed but thoroughly unable to escape. He did not bite. He did not need to. The scout simply lay still beneath him, wide-eyed with fear, and Kale held him there, with nothing more than his weight and his stillness, until Finn arrived to bind the man's hands. "Good catch," Finn said, breathless, clapping a hand briefly on Kale's shoulder, before thinking better of the gesture and pulling it back. an old habit of caution neither of them commented on. They marched both scouts back to the pack grounds well before dawn, and the news spread through the halls with the particular speed that only good news traveled at. The Alpha's son had caught 2 of Declan's scouts red-handed, with proof of their intentions sketched on hide for the whole council to see. What could have remained an ambiguous accusation, easy for Declan to deny, had instead become undeniable evidence, and the credit for catching it belonged entirely to the wolf the pack had spent years fearing rather than trusting. Ren heard the news before Cale had even finished delivering his report to Gideon, the story already racing through the healer's cabin by way of Iris, who arrived breathless and wide-eyed, with an account that had grown slightly more dramatic with each retelling along the way. He caught them himself, Iris said, setting down a basket of supplies with unusual excitement. Chased one down without laying a scratch on him. The whole patrol's talking about it. Ren felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest, pride so sharp it nearly stole her breath. She had always known there was more to Cale than the pack's fear allowed them to see, but watching that truth finally surface for everyone else to witness, watching him step into a role that used his instincts as a gift rather than treating them as a threat to be contained, felt like watching a long, slow storm finally begin to clear. She found him near the training yard an hour later, still faintly restless with the leftover energy of the chase, and the moment his eyes found hers across the distance, some of that restlessness visibly settled. "I heard," she said, coming to stand beside him. "The whole pack's heard." "I didn't hurt anyone," Cale said, and there was something almost disbelieving in the way he said it, like he still could not quite trust that he had managed a confrontation without it ending in blood. "I know," Ren said. "That's exactly why they're talking about it the way they are." He looked at her, something soft and searching in his expression, and reached out, hesitant at first, then more certain, to take her hand in his. It was a small gesture, ordinary to anyone watching, but Ren understood exactly what it cost him and exactly what it meant, and she curled her fingers around his without hesitation. "Your father wants to speak with the whole pack tonight," Cale said. "About the scouts, about the border." "And about you," Ren guessed. Cale's jaw tightened slightly, old nerves resurfacing. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of attention." "You don't have to be ready," Ren said gently. "You just have to stand there and let them see what I've already known for months. That's all it takes." He squeezed her hand, not quite in agreement, but close enough to one, and together they walked toward the main hall as the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, unaware that within the Eastern Territory, Declan had just received word of his captured scouts and was already turning his fury and his calculation toward a new and far more dangerous plan. The main hall had never held so many people at once, not in Cale's memory. Every corner of the pack seemed to have gathered, drawn by rumor and curiosity, packed shoulder to shoulder along the walls and filling every bench, until latecomers stood crowded near the doors. Gideon stood at the head of the room, the 2 captured scouts kneeling bound before him, the sketched map laid open on the table for anyone close enough to see. The murmuring quieted as he raised a hand. "2 nights ago," Gideon began, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "these 2 were caught mapping our patrol routes along the southern boundary. Caught, I should add, because of instincts sharper than any tracker this pack has trained in a generation." He turned, gesturing toward Cale, who stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, with Ren at his side, and every head in the room turned with him. Cale's shoulders tensed beneath the sudden weight of so many eyes, and Ren felt the shift in him instantly, the old instinct to retreat rising fast beneath his skin. She pressed her palm briefly against the small of his back, steady and unhurried, and though the touch was subtle enough that most of the crowd would not have noticed it at all, it was enough to keep his feet planted where they stood. "My son tracked their scent across 3 separate nights," Gideon continued, "identified their most likely position before any trained scout in this pack managed to, and when the confrontation came, subdued a fleeing scout without a single injury, to himself or to the man he caught." He paused, letting the words settle over the room. "I know many of you have spent this season, and seasons before it, viewing my son as something dangerous, something to be managed rather than trusted. I understand why. I will not pretend his path here has been an easy one, for him or for any of us." The hall had gone completely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on Gideon, on Cale, on the space between them where a father and son had spent years struggling to close a distance neither quite knew how to name. But what happened 7 nights ago, Gideon said, was not the act of someone broken. It was the act of a wolf who understands this pack's safety better than most of us give him credit for, and who chose, when given the chance, to protect it without a single drop of unnecessary harm. He looked directly at his son now, something raw and proud breaking through the careful authority of his voice. I am done apologizing for you, Kale. I think it is past time this pack started thanking you instead. A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain at first, and then, slowly, someone near the back began to clap. It caught, spreading hand to hand across the hall in a wave that grew steadier and louder until the whole room rang with it, an applause that Kale had never once imagined might be directed at him. He stood frozen for a long moment, overwhelmed, his breathing gone shallow and quick, and Ren watched the familiar signs of an approaching flood of feeling rise in him, the kind that had once, not so long ago, always ended in violence when it grew too large to contain. This time it did not. This time he simply reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, grounding himself against the noise and the attention through the one steady point he had learned to trust completely, and he let the applause wash over him instead of fighting it. Owen stood near the front of the crowd, his bandaged arm still healing, and when his eyes met Kale's across the room, something passed between them that was not quite an apology, but came close enough. He gave a short, stiff nod, and Kale returned it, an unspoken truce settling between two wolves who had, until recently, viewed each other as nothing but a threat. After the gathering finally dispersed, the crowd breaking into smaller clusters murmuring excitedly about the captured scouts and the son who had caught them, Gideon found Kale and Ren near the edge of the emptying hall. That wasn't easy for you, Gideon said quietly, watching his son's shoulders slowly begin to unwind from their defensive posture. No, Kale admitted. You did it anyway. Kale glanced at Ren, a small, private acknowledgement passing between them. I had help, he said. Gideon's gaze moved to Ren, warm and grateful in a way that needed no further words to explain itself, and Ren felt a flush of something unfamiliar rise in her chest, the strange, uncomfortable warmth of being seen and valued by people who had spent months looking past her entirely. I owe you more than I can easily say, Gideon told her. You don't owe me anything, Ren said. I just refuse to be afraid of something that never gave me a reason to be. Gideon studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful settling behind his eyes, and then he nodded slowly, as if some private decision had just been made. Even so, he said, this pack is going to remember what you did here, whether you want that attention or not. Ren was not sure, in that moment, whether his words were meant as reassurance or warning. Later, she would understand they had been both. Declan's retaliation came 11 days later, and it came in the one way none of them had properly prepared for. Ren had gone alone to gather herbs along the eastern edge of the woods, a stretch of forest she had walked 100 times before without incident, always within calling distance of the main grounds. The morning had started ordinary enough, cool and quiet, birdsong threading through the trees, and she had been crouched beside a patch of silverleaf, cutting stems with careful, practiced motions, when the first branch snapped behind her. She turned, expecting a patrol wolf, and found instead 2 strangers stepping out from the tree line, their scent unfamiliar, their eyes cold with purpose. You're the one of them said, studying her with open interest. The scarred girl. Declan will be pleased. Ren's blood went cold, but she did not freeze. She had spent too many years learning how to survive on instinct alone, to let fear steal the seconds she needed. She dropped her basket and bolted, cutting hard toward the tree line she knew led back toward the training grounds, but the stranger's longer stride closed the gap faster than she could outrun. A hand closed around her arm, wrenching her backward, and she twisted hard, driving her elbow into her attacker's ribs with every ounce of strength she had, buying herself half a second of freedom before the second stranger caught her from the other side. She screamed then, loud and sharp, a sound she hoped would carry. It did. Kale had been 3 ridges away on patrol when the wind shifted and carried her scent to him, laced with fear, in a way that stopped his heart cold. He did not wait for Finn or the rest of the patrol. He simply ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, tearing through the underbrush with a single-minded focus that blocked out everything except the growing certainty of exactly where she was and exactly how much danger she was in. He broke through the tree line just as the two strangers were dragging her toward the boundary line, and the sight of hands on her, of her struggling against a grip she could not break, sent something through him that was not the wild, uncontrolled fury the pack had spent years fearing. It was something colder, something focused. He hit the first stranger low and fast, a controlled tackle that drove the man hard into the ground without a single wasted motion, and had him pinned and subdued before the man could even fully register what had happened. The second stranger released Ren and turned to flee, but Cale was already moving again, cutting off the escape route with brutal efficiency, forcing the man to a stop with nothing more than his own immovable presence blocking the path. "Don't," Cale said, his voice low and utterly steady, carrying a weight of controlled menace that needed no teeth to back it up. "Take one more step and see what happens." The stranger froze, wisely choosing stillness over the alternative. Ren, breathing hard, scrambled to her feet and pressed a hand against her racing heart, watching Cale hold both intruders in place, with nothing more than presence and precise, controlled force. There was no wild fury in him now, no uncontrolled violence born of panic or provocation. There was only clear, deliberate protection, a wolf who understood exactly what he needed to do, and did precisely that much and no more. Finn and the rest of the patrol arrived minutes later, drawn by the sound of Ren's scream, and found the scene already resolved, both intruders bound and subdued without a single serious injury among them, Cale standing guard over them with Ren safely at his side. "You're not hurt?" Finn asked Ren, scanning her quickly for injuries. "Bruised," Ren said, still catching her breath. "Nothing worse." Finn's eyes moved to Cale, taking in the controlled stillness of him, the complete absence of the frenzied edge that usually accompanied his confrontations. "You didn't bite either of them," Finn observed, something like realization dawning across his face. "I didn't need to," Cale said simply. "They weren't going to hurt her while I was standing there. That's all that mattered." They marched the two captured men back to the pack grounds, and under questioning, both quickly confirmed what Gideon had already suspected. Declan had sent them specifically to capture Ren, believing correctly that she represented the single thread most likely to unravel Cale's carefully rebuilt control, hoping that either her capture or the resulting fury of her rescue might expose the very instability he had been counting on to weaken the pack's standing. He had been wrong, badly wrong. Rather than exposing weakness, the attempted capture had revealed exactly the opposite. A wolf capable of channeling even his most powerful instincts into precise, deliberate protection, rather than uncontrolled violence. A wolf who had grown, quietly and steadily, into something far stronger than the broken reputation that had followed him for years. Ren sat in the healer's cabin that evening, a warm cup of tea between her hands, still processing the fear of the morning, when Cale appeared in the doorway, hesitant in a way she had rarely seen from him. "Are you all right?" he asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. "I am," Ren said, "because of you." He crossed the room slowly, and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that still, after all these months, sometimes surprised her with how careful he could be. "I felt your fear before I even heard you scream," he said quietly. "It was like something tearing loose inside me. I've never moved that fast in my life." "I'm grateful you did," Ren said. "If anything had happened to you." He stopped, unable to finish the thought, his jaw tightening around words too large and too frightening to say aloud. "Nothing did," Ren said gently, reaching up to rest her palm against his cheek. "You made sure of that." Cale leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, something had settled in his expression, some final piece locking into place that had been loose and searching for months. "I don't know what I would have become," he said quietly, "if I'd lost you before I even understood what you meant to me." Ren's breath caught, the weight of the unspoken words beneath his sentence landing clear and unmistakable. "You don't have to find out," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." He pressed his forehead gently against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fear of the morning slowly dissolving into something quieter, steadier, the kind of closeness that had been building between them for months, and had finally, in the space of one terrifying morning, found its true shape. News of the failed capture reached every corner of the pack by the following morning, and with it came a shift in how the pack spoke about Kale that Ren had not fully anticipated. Where once the halls had buzzed with cautious whispers about the Alpha's dangerous son, they now carried a different kind of talk entirely, quieter but no less pervasive, filled with something close to reverence. "He didn't hurt either of them," Hazel said to a small cluster near the well, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "Just held them there, controlled, the whole time." Finn said it himself. "After everything that's happened this season," Callum added, "I don't think anyone can call him feral anymore." Not after that. Ren overheard the conversation on her way to the healer's cabin, and felt a complicated knot of emotions tighten in her chest. Pride tangled up with something that felt uncomfortably close to grief. She was glad, deeply glad, that the pack finally saw what she had always seen in him, but she also understood, in a way the others perhaps did not, exactly how much pain had shaped the young man who could now stand so calmly amid chaos. His control had not appeared overnight. It had been built, slowly and painfully, out of years of being feared and mistrusted, out of a childhood trauma the pack had never fully reckoned with, out of the quiet, patient work of learning to trust one person enough to let his guard down even slightly. She found Gideon in his study that afternoon, reviewing reports on the 2 captured intruders, and he looked up when she entered, with an expression that seemed lighter than she had seen on him in months. "The Council wants to formally recognize Kale's role in the border defense," Gideon said, setting down his papers. "Officially name him as head of the Eastern Patrol." "That's a significant step," Ren said carefully. "It is," Gideon agreed. "And I want your thoughts before I bring it to him. You understand him better than anyone in this pack, myself included, if I'm honest." Ren considered the question seriously, turning it over the way Kale himself so often turned over difficult things. "He'll be anxious about it," she said finally. "The attention, the responsibility, all of it, will weigh on him more heavily than it would weigh on someone else. But I think he's ready for it. I think he's been ready for longer than anyone realized, including himself." Gideon nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his features. "There's something else," he said. "The Council has also been discussing your role in all of this, formally recognizing the healer's assistance you've provided, not just to Kale, but to this pack as a whole this season." Ren blinked, caught off guard. "I haven't done anything the position doesn't already require of me." "You've done considerably more than that, and you know it," Gideon said gently. "You held steady when this pack was too afraid to. You saw something in my son that the rest of us had given up looking for. That kind of steadiness deserves recognition, whether you're comfortable accepting it or not." Ren did not know quite how to respond to that, unused as she was to the pack's careful attention after so long spent existing quietly at its edges, mostly overlooked, occasionally pitied, rarely truly seen. The idea of being recognized, formally and publicly, for something more than her scars or her Omega status, sat strangely in her chest, equal parts uncomfortable and, if she allowed herself to admit it, deeply longed for. She found Kale later that evening near the training yard, watching the sunset with the same quiet stillness that had once seemed unreadable to her, and now felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Your father wants to name you head of the Eastern Patrol," she said, settling beside him. Kale's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through his usual composure. "He told you before he told me?" "He wanted my thoughts first," Ren said. "I told him you were ready." "Are you certain?" Kale asked, and beneath the question she could hear the old uncertainty still lingering, the part of him that still, after everything, expected eventually to be found lacking. "I'm certain," Ren said firmly. "You've spent this whole season proving it, Kale. Not to me. I already knew. To everyone else who spent years assuming the worst about you." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade behind the tree line, and then he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with an ease that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. "None of it would have happened without you," he said. "You know that, don't you?" "It happened because of you," Ren corrected gently. "I just refused to look away." Kale turned to face her fully then, something steady and certain settling into his expression, the last traces of doubt finally giving way to something that looked, for the first time, like genuine peace. "Refusing to look away," he said quietly. might be the single greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Ren felt her chest tighten with emotion, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as the sky deepened into evening around them, the pack grounds settling into their nightly rhythms in the distance, a world that had slowly, quietly, learned to see both of them differently than it once had. Neither of them noticed, in that peaceful moment, the shadow of a lone figure, watching from the tree line at the edge of the grounds, patient and unseen, gathering the last piece of information Declan needed before making his final move. The attack came at midnight, 3 nights after the council formally named Cale head of the Eastern Patrol, and it came with far more force than anything Declan had risked before. The alarm horn tore through the pack grounds without warning, deep and urgent, and within seconds the entire camp had erupted into motion, wolves pouring from their quarters half-dressed, weapons drawn, forming defensive lines along the perimeter, with the practiced speed of a pack that trained constantly for exactly this possibility. Fire had broken out along the northern storage huts, deliberately set, and beneath the cover of smoke and chaos, a full raiding party from the Eastern Territory had breached the boundary line in force. Cale was already moving before the horn had finished sounding, his instincts sharpening into something cold and focused the moment he registered the scent of unfamiliar wolves inside the pack's borders. He found Finn near the northern line, directing wolves toward the fire, while a second group moved to intercept the raiders pressing in from the tree line. "Declan's here himself," Finn shouted over the chaos, pointing toward a cluster of raiders pushing hard toward the center of the grounds. "This isn't just scouts anymore." Cale's blood went cold with a realization that struck faster than fear. If Declan had come personally, if this was truly an all-out assault rather than another probing attempt, then his target would not be the storage huts or the borderline. It would be something far more personal. "Where's Ren?" Cale said, the words coming out low and urgent. Finn's face paled. "The healer's cabin. She'd have gone there to help with the wounded." Cale did not wait to hear anything else. He tore through the chaos of the fighting camp, with single-minded purpose, cutting past skirmishes and burning debris, following the one scent that mattered more to him than his own safety. He found the healer's cabin surrounded, 3 raiders closing in on the small building where Ren and 2 of the younger healers had barricaded themselves, tending to a handful of wounded pack members who had been carried there in the fighting's first chaotic minutes. The door had already begun to splinter under repeated blows when Cale arrived, and the sight of it, the direct threat to the one place and the one person he had spent months learning to protect above all else, ignited something in him that was neither the old uncontrolled fury nor the careful, measured control he had built since. It was something new, forged from both, precise and devastating, and utterly without hesitation. He moved through the 3 raiders with brutal efficiency, each confrontation ending fast, controlled enough to leave no permanent harm, but forceful enough to leave no doubt about the outcome. He was not fighting like a wolf who feared losing control. He was fighting like a wolf who understood exactly what he was protecting, and exactly what he was capable of, and the difference showed in every precise, deliberate movement. The cabin door swung open just as he subdued the final raider, and Ren appeared in the doorway, breathless, a healer's blade gripped tightly in one white-knuckled hand, having clearly been prepared to defend the wounded inside with whatever means she had. Her eyes found his across the small clearing, and something in her chest broke open with relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. "You're all right," Cale said, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, checking for injury with an urgency that made his hands tremble. "I'm all right," Ren confirmed, gripping his wrists to steady him, to steady herself. "You made sure of that." Behind them, the sounds of fighting continued to rage across the camp, but for one suspended moment, neither of them moved, simply holding on to the fact of each other's safety amid the chaos. The moment did not last. A new sound cut through the clearing, low and deliberate, and both of them turned to find Declan himself standing at the tree line, flanked by 2 remaining wolves, his eyes fixed on Cale, with cold, calculating interest. "So the stories were true after all," Declan said, stepping forward slowly. "The feral son, fighting like a proper alpha at last. How disappointing for me. I had hoped to find you unraveled by now." "You attacked my pack," Cale said, his voice carrying a steadiness that seemed to unsettle Declan more than any display of rage could have. "You threatened her. That ends tonight. Bold words, Declan said. From a wolf, half this pack, still believes cannot control himself. They believed wrong, Cale said, and stepped forward, placing himself firmly between Declan and Ren, his stance settling into something immovable, something that made even Declan's confident advance falter half a step. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive. Reinforcements arrived within moments, Gideon at their head, and the sight of the Alpha himself charging into the clearing, flanked by a dozen furious pack members who had already begun turning the tide against the raiders elsewhere in the camp, was enough to shatter whatever confidence remained in Declan's calculated gamble. He retreated, dragging his remaining wolves with him, disappearing back across the boundary line, with promises of consequences that rang hollow against the reality of his failed assault. By the time the sun rose over the pack grounds, the fires had been contained, the wounded tended to, and the raiding party fully repelled, leaving behind nothing but scorched storage huts and the wreckage of a plan that had utterly failed to achieve its purpose. Cale sat outside the healer's cabin as dawn broke, exhausted but unharmed, Ren beside him, with her head resting against his shoulder, both of them too spent for words, simply grateful to still have each other in the quiet aftermath. "He's not going to stop," Ren said eventually, her voice heavy with the weight of the night behind them. "Maybe not," Cale said, "but he knows now what happens when he tries." He turned to look at her, something fierce and steady in his gaze. And so does everyone else. The council gathered again 3 days after the attack, and this time, the hall filled faster than it ever had before, every member of the pack eager to hear how the border war with the Eastern Territory would finally be settled. Gideon stood at the head of the table, looking tired but resolute, and beside him stood Cale, no longer hovering at the edges of the crowd the way he once had, but standing with the quiet, settled confidence of someone who finally understood his place within the pack he had spent so long fearing might never fully accept him. Declan's assault failed, Gideon announced to the gathered hall, not because of superior numbers or superior strategy, but because this pack, every single member of it, refused to break under pressure. And I want it known clearly, before this council and before every wolf here, that the wolf who led the defense of our healer's cabin, who held the line against Declan himself, is the same wolf many of you spent years fearing, rather than trusting. He turned to Cale, something deeply proud settling into his expression. My son has spent his whole life being defined by the worst moments of his past, moments none of us fully understood, moments he never chose. I am done letting that definition stand. Cale is not feral. He never was. He was a wolf, carrying more pain than any of us bothered to look closely enough to see, and it took someone with more patience and more courage than the rest of us combined to finally help him carry it. Every eye in the hall turned, inevitably, toward Ren, standing quietly near the back of the crowd, her scar catching the afternoon light in a way she no longer instinctively tried to hide. "Come forward," Gideon said gently. Ren hesitated only a moment before stepping through the parting crowd, feeling every eye in the hall settle on her with an attention she had spent years learning to live without. Cale reached for her hand the moment she reached his side, steady and certain, and together, they stood before the full gathered council, no longer the feared son and the overlooked Omega, but two people the entire pack had watched, over the course of one long and difficult season, become something neither fear nor pity could fully capture anymore. "This pack owes both of you a debt," Gideon said, addressing the hall as much as he addressed them, "and I intend to see it repaid properly. Cale will remain head of the Eastern Patrol, with full authority to shape it as he sees fit. Ren," he turned to her directly, his voice warm, "will be granted a formal seat on this council, as a healer whose judgment and courage this pack has come to rely on, as much as any warrior's blade." A murmur of approval swept through the hall, and this time it was not the cautious, uncertain kind that had followed Gideon's first attempt to defend his son. It was warm, immediate, and unreserved, the sound of a pack finally releasing years of misplaced fear, and replacing it with something closer to genuine respect. Owen stepped forward from the crowd, his once injured arm now fully healed, and extended his hand toward Cale with an openness that would have seemed impossible months earlier. "I owe you an apology," Owen said. "I spent this whole season calling you dangerous. Turns out I was just too proud to admit I'd earned every bit of that bite myself." Kale studied the offered hand for a moment, old instincts still cautious even now, and then accepted it. A firm, brief shake that carried more weight than either of them could easily put into words. "We're even," Kale said simply, and something in Owen's expression eased with visible relief. The hall slowly began to disperse afterward, wolves gathering in small clusters to discuss the day's proceedings, the mood lighter and freer than it had been in longer than most of them could remember. Gideon found his son and Ren near the edge of the emptying hall, watching them both with the quiet satisfaction of a father who had finally watched his son find solid ground. "Thank you," Gideon said simply, addressing Ren once more. "You don't need to keep thanking me," Ren said, smiling faintly. "I only ever did what felt right." "That's precisely why it deserves thanks," Gideon said. "Most people, faced with the choice you were faced with, would have chosen the easier, safer path. You never did." Ren glanced up at Kale, finding him already watching her with an expression that held nothing back anymore. No guardedness, no old fear of being too much or too little for the people around him. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, completely at peace. "I never needed the easier path," Ren said quietly. "I just needed someone worth staying for." Kale's hand tightened around hers, and he leaned down, resting his forehead gently against hers, the way he had learned to over the months, a gesture that had become entirely their own. "You'll always have that," he murmured, "for as long as I have anything to give." Outside the hall, the pack grounds settled into the golden light of late afternoon, the scorched storage huts already being rebuilt, the wounded already healing, the whole community slowly stitching itself back together, stronger than it had been before. The story that would travel through the pack's history from this season forward would not be the one about the Alpha's feral son who bit everyone who came near him. It would be the story of a broken boy who found, in one scarred and steady Omega, the single thread of trust strong enough to hold him together, and who had, in turn, become strong enough to hold an entire pack together when it mattered most. Ren and Kale walked out into the evening light together, no longer trailing a careful half-step apart, but side by side, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next, exactly the way they had faced everything so far. Together,